The sun was soft that afternoon. The sky was a pale blue with thin clouds drifting above. The funeral was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy in the chest. People stood in small groups around the casket, some with heads bowed, others holding tissues close to their faces. It was a moment meant for grief, for goodbye, not for anything else. Keanu Reeves stood near the family, dressed in a plain black suit, his hands folded in front of him, his face calm but filled with respect. He had come quietly, no cameras, no attention, just to be there for a friend who had passed. The priest spoke gentle words, his voice carrying softly in the cool breeze. The leaves in the trees swayed slowly as if they too were listening. Every eye was on the casket, until the sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel drew a few glances. A police officer in uniform was walking towards the group. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he was here for traffic or safety. But his steps were quick, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on someone in the crowd. Then, without warning, the officer's hand moved to his holster in one swift motion. He pulled out his gun and aimed it directly at Keanu. Gasps broke the silence like shattered glass. The family froze. One woman covered her mouth. A man dropped the flower he was holding. The officer's voice was sharp and loud. On the ground. Now. He barked, his tone cutting through the soft prayers. Keanu didn't move right away, not from fear, but from surprise. His eyes showed confusion. He glanced around as if trying to understand why this was happening. People began to step back, creating a space around him, some holding up their hands, others pulling out their phones. The peaceful air of the funeral was gone, replaced by a thick tension, a pulse of panic that made hearts race. The grieving family pleaded, "Please." "He's not doing anything," one of them said. But the officer didn't lower his weapon. His eyes were narrowed, his voice hard. "Down. Now." He repeated, each word louder than the last. The priest stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Officer, this is a funeral. You are making a mistake." His voice was steady, but there was a tremble of anger beneath it. Keanu slowly raised his hands, his voice calm, gentle. "It's okay. I'm not going anywhere," he said, speaking softly, almost as if to soothe the officer rather than himself. His movements were slow, controlled, showing no sign of aggression, but the gun stayed aimed, the metal catching the dull light of the afternoon. Some people in the crowd began recording, the red dots of phone cameras blinking. Someone whispered, "That's Keanu Reeves." Another replied, "Why is he pointing a gun at him?" The confusion rippled through the crowd. No one could make sense of it. The air was thick with disbelief. The officer's stance was stiff, his finger close to the trigger. The moment stretched on painfully long, every second feeling like a minute. The family looked torn between grief and fear. The sound of a woman quietly sobbing broke through. The man beside her wrapped an arm around her shoulder, keeping his eyes on the gun. Keanu stayed still, his voice low but clear. "Let's talk about this, okay?" he said, taking a slow breath. "I'm not who you think I am." His tone carried a patience that seemed out of place for someone in his position. It was as if he was more concerned about keeping the situation calm than about his own safety. Somewhere in the distance, another sound rose, the faint wail of sirens growing closer. The officer's eyes flickered, but he didn't move the gun. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing towards the cemetery gates, hoping the approaching sound meant help was coming. Then a young man in the crowd, his voice shaking, called out, "You're pointing a gun at the wrong man. He's here to honor the dead." A few others murmured agreement, courage slowly replacing fear in their voices. They stepped forward slightly, closing the space between themselves and Keanu, creating a kind of human shield without even planning. The tension was a living thing now, pressing down on everyone. The smell of fresh-cut flowers mixed with the cold scent of metal in the air. The casket sat between the mourners and the grave, a quiet reminder that this day was supposed to be about loss, not conflict. Keanu's eyes never left the officer, not in challenge, but in quiet control. He seemed to be holding the weight of the moment in his calm. The sirens grew louder, and soon, 2 more officers appeared at the edge of the crowd. Moving quickly when they saw what was happening, the aggressive officer kept his weapon up for a moment longer, his jaw tight. But something shifted in his expression when one of the new arrivals stepped between him and Keanu. Speaking in urgent whispers, the crowd exhaled as the gun finally lowered. The danger passing like a storm moving on. But the damage left behind was heavy. The funeral would go on, but no one there would forget how the silence of grief had been broken by the sharp edge of fear, and how the man in the black suit had faced a gun at a friend's burial, and somehow kept the peace. The sound of the sirens was fading in the distance now. But the shock of what had just happened still hung in the air. People tried to return their attention to the casket, but their eyes kept drifting toward Keanu and the officer who had pointed the gun at him. The officer stood a short distance away now, his face tense, his hands shifting restlessly as if he didn't know what to do next. Keanu stayed where he was, his hands still raised slightly. Though the gun was no longer pointed at him, his voice was steady when he finally spoke. "May I put my hands down now?" The words were soft, but they cut through the air. One of the newly arrived officers nodded, "Yes, sir," and Keanu slowly lowered his arms, his movements careful. The aggressive officer spoke suddenly, his tone sharp. "I had reason to believe you were acting suspicious." His eyes narrowed as if trying to justify what had just happened. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Someone from the back called out, "Suspicious?" He was standing still like everyone else. The family of the deceased looked shaken. The widow clutched the arm of an older man, her eyes wet not only from grief, but from the fear of what could have happened. She looked at Keanu with a mixture of apology and sorrow, as though she felt responsible for the chaos and what should have been a peaceful goodbye. Keanu took a small step toward the officer, his voice calm but firm. "You've made a mistake. I'm here to pay my respects, nothing more." His words were simple, not angry, but they carried weight. The officer didn't answer right away. He shifted his gaze to the other officers as if seeking silent support, but they stayed quiet. One of the mourners stepped forward, a middle-aged man holding his phone in one hand. "I have the whole thing on video," he said, his voice firm. "You pointed your weapon at an innocent man. You need to explain yourself." More people nodded in agreement. The tension was growing again. The officer's jaw tightened. "We received a report of someone matching his description, carrying a weapon in the area," he said, trying to keep his voice even, but it sounded thin against the truth of what everyone had seen. Keanu's hands were empty the entire time. No weapon, no threat. Nothing that could justify what had just happened. Keanu shook his head slightly. "There's no weapon. There never was," he said. "You could have asked, you could have spoken to me." His voice carried a quiet disappointment, the kind that made listeners feel the weight of it more than if he had shouted. The crowd's murmur grew louder, people exchanging glances, some recording every second, others whispering about how quickly the news would spread. The widow spoke up then, her voice trembling. "He was here for my husband's funeral. You humiliated him in front of everyone." There was no anger in her voice, just deep hurt. The officer glanced at her, his posture stiff, but he said nothing. The other 2 officers looked uneasy. One of them stepped closer to Keanu and the widow, speaking in a softer tone. "We'll handle this. I'm sorry for the disruption." Keanu gave a small nod, turning back to the widow. "Please, let's continue. This day is about him, not about me," he said, gently placing his hand over hers for a brief moment. It was a gesture meant to pull the attention back to where it belonged. The priest cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd. "We will continue the service," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. The mourners slowly turned back toward the casket, though the air was still heavy with what had happened. As the prayers resumed, the officer who had drawn his gun stood at the edge of the crowd, his gaze fixed on the ground. People avoided looking at him, their attention instead lingering on Keanu, who stood silently, his head bowed, his hands folded once again. Inside, he must have felt the sting of humiliation, but his posture never showed it. He stayed composed, letting the focus remain on the grieving family. His calmness seemed to steady those around him, easing the tension that had threatened to boil over. When the final words of the service were spoken and the casket was lowered, Keanu stepped forward quietly, placing a single white lily on top. He stood there for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the flowers as they rested on the wood. Then he stepped back, blending into the crowd. The officer who had started the chaos shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing how out of place his earlier actions had been. He kept glancing toward Keanu but didn't say a word. The other officers remained near him, perhaps to ensure he didn't make another rash move. As people began to leave the cemetery, whispers followed Keanu, some thanking him for staying calm, others shaking their heads at the thought of what could have happened. A few even clapped him lightly on the shoulder, their eyes filled with quiet respect. Keanu didn't stay long after. He spoke briefly to the widow, offering his condolences once more, and then walked toward the edge of the cemetery, his stride steady, as if determined not to let the incident define the day. But the looks on people's faces made it clear that no one would forget it. The funeral had been meant to honor a life, but it had also shown everyone there a glimpse of how quickly peace can shatter, and how one person's choice can turn grief into fear. Yet somehow, in the middle of it all, Keanu's calm had kept it from spiraling into something far worse. The funeral was over, but the tension was not gone. People were walking slowly toward the parking lot, speaking in low voices. Many kept glancing back toward Keanu and the officer who had pulled the gun. The memory of that moment was still fresh in their minds. It was the kind of thing that left a mark on a person's heart. Even if no one was hurt, Keanu stayed near the gate for a while, speaking softly to a few mourners. His tone calm, his eyes gentle, but he could feel the eyes of others watching, some with concern, some with disbelief at what they had just witnessed. A few people came closer to him. One woman with gray hair shook her head and said quietly, "You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen." Most people would have shouted or run. Keanu smiled faintly. "Running would have made it worse," he said. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt." In another corner of the cemetery, the officer who had aimed the gun was pacing, his face tight, his shoulders stiff. He kept glancing toward the group, but didn't approach. His two fellow officers stood near him, speaking in hushed tones, one of them looking frustrated, as if they had been forced into cleaning up a mess they hadn't created. A small group of mourners began to gather near the gate, their voices no longer whispering. A middle-aged man in a dark coat spoke loudly enough for the officer to hear. "You could have killed him, right here at a funeral, in front of everyone." His voice carried anger and disbelief. A younger woman beside him added, "And for what?" He was standing still, doing nothing. The officer looked away, his jaw tightening. Keanu noticed the growing tension and stepped toward the group, lifting a hand in a calming gesture. "Please," he said softly, "let's not make this worse." His voice was almost soothing, the kind of tone that makes people pause. What's done is done. The important thing is no one was hurt. But not everyone was ready to let it go. A man holding his phone stepped forward, raising it slightly. "I have this all on video. The world is going to see what happened here." His voice carried a note of determination. Several people murmured in agreement. Others nodded. It was clear the video was already on its way to social media. The officer finally spoke, his voice defensive. "You don't understand, we got a call. A report about someone matching his description. We can't take chances." His words hung in the air, but no one seemed convinced. "Matching his description?" The gray-haired woman repeated. "Do you know who this man is?" "He's one of the kindest people alive." Keanu stepped closer, not in anger, but with quiet strength. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said. "It matters how we treat each other, especially in moments like this." His gaze was steady, his words slow, letting them sink in. "I'm not here to fight you, officer, But you could have asked a question before drawing your gun. The crowd murmured again, some with approval, others shaking their heads at the memory of the gun pointed in the middle of the service. The officer didn't respond. He looked down at the ground. Perhaps realizing that anything he said now would sound hollow, the priest walked over then. His hands clasped, his expression calm but firm. "Officer," he said quietly, "you disrupted a sacred moment. You frightened people who were already grieving. You owe them peace, not fear." The words were simple, but they carried weight. One of the other officers touched the aggressive cop's arm, speaking low. "Let's go," he said. And after a moment's hesitation, they began walking toward their patrol car, the crowd. Watching every step, no one stopped recording as they left. The group around Keanu seemed to relax slightly. The air felt lighter, though the memory of the incident still lingered. A young man in a dark jacket turned to Keanu. "Are you going to press charges?" he asked. Keanu shook his head. "No, not today. Today is about honoring someone we lost." His voice was steady, but his eyes held a quiet sadness. The widow approached him again, her voice soft. "I'm so sorry for what happened. You didn't deserve that." Keanu smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. You've already lost enough today," he said, his words carrying a kind warmth that seemed to lift a little of her burden, even if only for a moment. People began to leave in small groups. The video from the phone was already spreading. Messages and alerts were starting to ping in the pockets of those present. Whispers about millions of views and news coverage floated through the air. But Keanu didn't seem interested. He was focused on making sure the family was supported. Before leaving, he helped an elderly guest to their car, carried a bouquet of flowers for someone whose hands were full, and quietly said goodbye to the widow when he finally walked toward his own car. The crowd parted for him, some offering nods of respect, others simply watching in silence. The parking lot was filled with the sound of engines starting, doors closing, and the distant hum of traffic. But in the minds of everyone who had been there, the image of that officer pointing a gun in the middle of a funeral would not fade quickly, nor would the image of the man who stood calmly in front of it. It was clear to those who had seen it with their own eyes that this was not the end of the story. Something would come of it, and soon the entire world would know. The cemetery had mostly emptied, but the weight of what happened still pressed on the people who remained. Keanu stood beside his car, speaking quietly with the widow. The air was cool, the breeze soft, but there was a tension underneath, something unspoken that everyone could feel. Far across the parking lot, the officer who had caused the scene stood with his arms crossed, talking in low tones to the two other officers. They were looking around, as if worried more eyes were watching than they wanted. It wasn't long before a new sound broke the uneasy quiet. The low hum of another police cruiser pulling in, this one driven by a senior officer. His uniform crisp, his steps measured as he got out. He scanned the area quickly, his gaze moving from the gathered mourners to Keanu, then to the aggressive officer. Without a word, he walked straight toward them. People noticed the way his presence seemed to shift the air. There was authority in his stride, not just from rank, but from the way he carried himself. He didn't stop to shake hands or greet anyone. He went directly to the two officers who had arrived earlier and spoke with them briefly, their answers short, their faces tense. Then he turned toward the officer who had drawn his weapon and gestured for him to step aside. The conversation that followed was low enough that most people couldn't hear the words, but they could see the body language. The senior officer's voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that didn't need to be loud to have power. The aggressive officer's shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched. He tried to speak, but the senior officer raised a hand to stop him. It was clear he wasn't interested in excuses. After a moment, the senior officer looked toward Keanu and the widow. He walked over slowly, removing his cap as a sign of respect. "Sir," he said to Keanu. "Ma'am," he added to the widow. "I apologize on behalf of the department for what happened here today." This should never have taken place. Not here, not in this way. His voice carried a weight that made it clear he meant every word. Keanu nodded slightly. I appreciate your words, he said. But the focus today should be on her and her family. He gestured toward the widow, his voice steady. I don't want this moment to take away from her grief. The widow gave him a grateful look, tears still in her eyes. The senior officer promised that the matter would be handled immediately, that steps were already being taken. His eyes flicked toward the patrol car, where the aggressive officer now sat in the passenger seat. His expression dark, it was clear to anyone watching that something was changing in that moment. Meanwhile, a few people in the crowd were quietly sharing the videos they had taken. One woman whispered to another, "It's already on Twitter. It's blowing up," another replied. "This is going to be everywhere by tonight." The news was moving faster than anyone could stop it, and the police department seemed to know it. The senior officer thanked Keanu for remaining calm. Most people wouldn't have handled it the way you did, he said. You prevented this from becoming something far worse. Keanu shook his head. I just didn't want anyone else to get hurt. His tone was simple, not dramatic, as if he were stating the most obvious truth. As the senior officer returned to his cruiser, the other two officers began guiding the aggressive one toward the back seat. There was no shouting, no handcuffs. But the image was powerful. The man who had moments ago stood with a weapon in his hand was now being removed from the scene entirely. People watched in silence, some recording, others just taking in the sight. When the car pulled away, the tension seemed to ease just a little. The air felt lighter, though the memory of what happened would not fade quickly. The senior officer stayed behind for a few minutes, speaking quietly to the widow, offering his condolences and promising to follow up personally. Keanu took a few steps away from the crowd. Standing for a moment under the shade of a tree, he closed his eyes briefly, perhaps taking in the quiet now that the chaos had passed. He could still hear faint murmurs behind him, but the sound of leaves in the wind was stronger, grounding. The widow walked over to him, her voice soft. I don't know how you stayed so calm, she said. I thought something terrible was going to happen. Keanu gave a small smile. I've learned that meeting fear with fear only makes it grow. Sometimes you have to be the still point in the storm. His words were simple but carried a depth that made her nod slowly. As they stood there, a few of the mourners approached. One last time, thanking him for his composure, for protecting the peace of the moment, even when he was the target. Each thank you seemed to surprise him, as though he didn't think he'd done anything unusual. Eventually, people began to leave. In earnest, cars pulling out of the lot one by one, the priest gave Keanu a quiet nod before walking toward his own car. And soon the cemetery was nearly empty, just the sound of the breeze and the occasional bird in the distance. Keanu didn't rush to leave. He stood by the casket for a final moment, placing his hand gently on the wood, whispering something no one else could hear. Then he turned and walked to his car, sliding into the driver's seat with the same calm he had carried all day. What no one knew yet was that while the cemetery had gone still, the rest of the world was waking up to the story. The videos were spreading fast, the headlines were being written, and before the sun set, millions of people would see exactly what had happened when a police officer pointed a gun at Keanu Reeves during a funeral, and how justice had already begun to move. By the time Keanu left the cemetery, the quiet streets around it were already carrying whispers of what had happened. He drove away without a rush, his hands steady on the wheel, but he had no idea that in the digital world, the moment was already spreading like wildfire. In homes and cafes and offices, people were looking at their phones and gasping at the footage. The first video appeared online less than an hour after the funeral ended. It showed the entire scene, Keanu standing in his black suit, the officer with his gun drawn, the crowd frozen in shock, and Keanu's calm voice breaking the tension. The clip was less than a minute long, but it carried a weight that words Alone could never match. On social media, comments poured in almost instantly. Why would a cop point a gun at Keanu Reeves during a funeral? One user wrote, another said, "This man is pure calm under pressure. Unbelievable." People from around the world began sharing the video, adding their own outrage and disbelief. Hashtags began trending. Hashtag justice for Keanu. Hashtag respect at funerals. And hashtag police accountability shot up in the rankings. News outlets picked it up within hours. First local channels, then national ones. Headlines appeared in bold letters. Officer points gun at actor during funeral. Celebrity remains. Calm as armed police disrupt service. The images attached to these stories were striking. Keanu with his hands slightly raised, his expression calm but solemn, standing among rows of mourners in living rooms. People debated over what they had seen. Some were furious, demanding that the officer be fired immediately. Others were shocked that something like this could happen to someone so widely known and respected. "If this can happen to him," one woman said during a TV interview, "imagine what happens to people without cameras watching." Meanwhile, Keanu was unaware of the scale his story had taken. He spent the evening quietly, keeping to himself. He didn't post about it, didn't give a statement. He simply stayed in the background, letting the family grieve without more attention drawn to them. But the world was not going to let the moment fade. By nightfall, the video had been viewed over 5 million times. Celebrities began commenting, some expressing support for Keanu, others calling out the officer's actions directly. One well-known director tweeted, "Keanu Reeves is the most respectful man I know. This is beyond unacceptable." Another actor wrote, "Handled with more grace than most could ever manage." The police department began feeling the pressure almost immediately. Their official accounts were flooded with demands for an explanation. Reporters camped outside their headquarters, eager for any statement. Inside the department, conversations were tense. The chief knew this wasn't just a local matter anymore. It was a national story. That same night, the department released a short message to the press saying they were aware of the incident and conducting an immediate review. They offered no details, no explanation, just a promise of investigation. But for many, that wasn't enough. The video was too clear, the actions too visible. In some corners of the internet, people began digging into the officer's past. Old complaints surfaced. Stories from previous encounters were shared. Nothing had ever gone viral before. But now, every piece of information was being collected and passed around. Keanu's friends began reaching out to him privately, asking if he was okay, offering their support. Some told him to speak publicly, to take control of the story, but he refused. "This isn't about me," he told one close friend over the phone. "It's about the fact that something like this happened at a funeral, during a moment meant for peace." His words, simple and steady, only made his friend respect him more. In online forums, people praised not only his calm reaction, but his refusal to turn it into a personal spotlight. He's not milking this. He's not making it about himself. And that's exactly why people love him. One commenter wrote, "The next morning, major news networks were running the footage on loop. Anchors described the scene in detail. Legal experts discussed the potential consequences for the officer. Some predicted suspension. Others believed termination was inevitable." One former police captain said, "That was a clear violation of procedure. And the fact it happened to someone so recognizable will make this case impossible to ignore." Public pressure continued to grow. Petitions started online, gathering tens of thousands of signatures in just hours. They called for the officer's removal and for stricter guidelines on the use of force in public gatherings. All the while, Keanu kept to himself, avoiding the cameras. But his silence didn't make the story fade. If anything, it made people talk about him even more. His choice not to attack the officer publicly was seen as a sign of dignity. One commentator on television said, "He showed more discipline in that moment than the man holding the gun." By the end of the second day, the video had been viewed over 20 million times. shared in multiple languages, picked up by outlets in Europe, Asia, and South America. It had become not just a story about a funeral, but a discussion about respect, restraint, and justice. The world was watching closely now, waiting for what would happen next. The police department could no longer hope it would fade away on its own. The question was no longer if action would be taken, it was when. And though Keanu had not asked for any of this, he had become once again a quiet example of how to face injustice without letting anger take control. His calm at the funeral had stopped a dangerous moment from turning into a tragedy. And now, his silence was letting the truth speak for itself. The third morning after the funeral, the city was already buzzing with the story. The video of the officer pointing a gun at Keanu had now been played on every major news channel. Talk shows were discussing it, radio hosts were asking callers for their opinions, and people on social media were still posting clips and screenshots with angry captions. The world was not letting it go. At the police department, the atmosphere was heavy. The chief had called for an internal investigation the very night the incident happened. Now, days later, statements had been taken from witnesses. The body cam footage had been reviewed, and the truth was clear. Keanu had done nothing wrong. There had been no weapon, no threat, nothing that could have justified the officer's actions. The officer in question, now suspended from duty, sat in a small office, staring at the floor. He had not spoken to the media, and the department wasn't letting him. But inside the building, people were talking. Some officers were furious that he had embarrassed the force. Others said they were not surprised given his past complaints. Meanwhile, outside in the world, petitions calling for his removal had passed 100,000 signatures. More people were sharing their own experiences of being treated unfairly by authority. The story had grown beyond Keanu. It had become part of a much bigger conversation. Reporters were now waiting outside Keanu's home, hoping for a statement. But he didn't come to the door. He left quietly through a side entrance when he needed to go somewhere. His close friends said he wasn't hiding. He was just refusing to add fuel to the fire. "If I speak now, people will focus on me instead of the real issue," he explained to one friend over the phone that day. The police department released a longer statement. It confirmed that an officer had violated protocol and that disciplinary action would follow. It also mentioned that the body cam footage matched the witness accounts. Keanu had been standing still, hands visible, and was never a threat. The statement ended with an apology to him and to the public. News outlets reported the apology instantly, but for many, it wasn't enough. They wanted to see consequences. Words mean nothing without action. One man told a reporter outside the police station. A woman nearby nodded, saying, "If it was any of us, we'd be in jail already, so why is he still free?" Back at his home, Keanu was sitting at a wooden table, sipping tea. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, fans, and journalists, but he kept most of them unanswered. Instead, he focused on reading a letter he had received from the widow of the funeral. Her handwriting was neat but shaky. She thanked him for protecting the peace of the day, for refusing to let the chaos take over the moment of goodbye. She wrote, "You showed my family grace when the world was giving us fear." Keanu folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer. He didn't smile, but there was a quiet warmth in his eyes. Later that afternoon, a representative from the police department came to see him in person. The man was polite, wearing a suit instead of a uniform. He explained that the officer had been officially charged with gross misconduct and would face a disciplinary hearing within the week. He also said that the chief himself wanted to apologize face-to-face. Keanu listened patiently, then simply replied, "I'm willing to meet him, but only if the family is included. This isn't just about me." That evening, the story reached another peak when a major network aired an exclusive analysis of the body cam footage. The video showed exactly what everyone had described: Keanu standing still, the officer approaching fast, pulling his gun without warning, and the mourners shouting in shock. Experts on the program pointed out every step where the officer should have acted differently. It was damning. Public reaction was immediate. People flooded the department's social media pages with demands for the officer's removal. Several celebrities reposted the analysis, calling it clear proof of misconduct. One well-known musician wrote, "He didn't even flinch when a gun was in his face. That's strength." The officer, now staying away from the public, reportedly told a colleague that he had just been doing his job. But even inside the department, that excuse was wearing thin. Most agreed that his decision had been reckless, dangerous, and entirely unnecessary. As the night came, Keanu sat in his living room, the lights dim, a record player turning slowly in the corner. He wasn't thinking about the headlines. He wasn't thinking about the officer. His mind was on the friend he had lost, the reason he had been at the funeral in the first place. He whispered a few words to himself, a kind of quiet goodbye. But even in that moment of personal reflection, he knew the situation wasn't over. He could feel the momentum building outside. The public wasn't going to let this case fade away like so many others. This time, people wanted resolution. They wanted to see the story end with justice. The hearing was set for the following week, and though Keanu didn't plan to attend, he knew the outcome would matter, not for him alone, but for everyone who had ever been in the same position. Without the benefit of cameras, without the protection of fame. For now, all he could do was wait and hope that the same calm he had shown at the funeral would guide everyone involved to do the right thing. The day of the hearing came with a gray sky, the kind that seemed to match the seriousness of what was about to happen. Outside the police department building, reporters stood in clusters, cameras ready, microphones in hand. People had gathered too, holding signs that read things like "Justice for all" and "Respect at all times." The air was cool but tense. Every person there knew that this decision would be watched by thousands, maybe millions inside. The hearing room was small and plain, no flashing lights, no big stage, just a table where the panel sat and a seat for the officer facing charges. He walked in with his head slightly down, wearing a pressed uniform but without the confidence he once carried. His eyes avoided the cameras that had been allowed inside for a few minutes. The chief of police sat at the head of the panel, his face stern, his voice calm but heavy with authority. He read out the charges: gross misconduct, violation of use of force policy, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. Each word seemed to land harder than the last. The room was quiet except for the sound of paper being moved. Witnesses were called in, one by one, to give their accounts. Several mourners from the funeral spoke clearly, explaining exactly what they had seen. Their voices carried the same disbelief they had felt that day. One woman said, "We were in the middle of saying goodbye, and suddenly there was a gun in Keanu's face. I couldn't believe it." Another added, "He never moved, never threatened anyone. There was no reason for that weapon to be drawn." The body cam footage was played next. The video filled the room with its sharp images and clear sound. It showed Keanu standing with his hands visible, the officer walking up quickly, and the sudden moment the gun came out. The gasps from the crowd in the footage echoed the gasps in the hearing room now. The video ended with the arrival of the other officers and the weapon being lowered. When it was the officer's turn to speak, he shifted in his chair, his voice low. "I believed I had a reason at the time," he began. But the panel pressed him. "What specific reason?" One member asked. His answer was vague. "A report came in about someone matching his description." The chief leaned forward. "And did you confirm that before pulling your weapon?" The officer hesitated. "No, sir," his voice barely above a whisper. The chief nodded slowly, as if the answer had been expected, but still carried weight. "Then your actions placed civilians in unnecessary danger," he said. The room stayed silent. The officer didn't try to argue further. After a short break, the panel returned with their decision. The chief spoke firmly. "Given the clear evidence, the testimonies, and the violation of department policy, this officer is hereby dismissed from the police force effective immediately. There was no applause, just a heavy sense of relief and finality. The officer nodded once, stood, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the news spread quickly. Reporters rushed to share the outcome. Cameras flashed as statements were. Read, officer removed from duty after drawing weapon on actor at funeral. The headlines were already forming. People in the crowd began talking in louder voices now. Some smiling in satisfaction, others simply nodding as if to say, "It's about time." Keanu wasn't at the hearing, but he heard the news from a friend who called him right after. There was a pause on the line, and then Keanu simply said, "Good. Now maybe the family can have some peace." His voice carried no celebration, just quiet acknowledgement. Later that day, the police chief called him directly. "Mr. Reeves, I want to apologize once again, and to thank you for your patience during this process," he said. Keanu's reply was simple. "I hope your department uses this as a chance to make sure it never happens again." The chief promised they would, in the hours that followed. The decision became the top story online. People praised the fact that action had been taken quickly. Others noted that public attention had played a big role. One commentator wrote, "This is what happens when people stay calm, tell the truth, and refuse to let the story be buried." At his home, Keanu read a few of the articles but didn't dwell on them. He spent the evening quietly, the same way he had in the days before. His thoughts still with the friend he had lost. In his mind, the real story wasn't about the gun, the officer, or even the hearing. It was about making sure the funeral had remained, in the end, an act of respect. That night, a message from the widow arrived on his phone. "It's over now. Thank you for standing so still that day. You kept everyone calm." It was a simple line, but it carried a depth that made him pause. He typed back only 2 words. "Always here." The world outside might have been celebrating the headline, but for Keanu, the victory was quieter. It was knowing that the moment had been handled without more harm, that dignity had been kept even in the face of fear, and that justice, for once, had been swift. The days after the hearing felt calmer. The rush of cameras, interviews, and headlines began to fade, but the memory of what happened still lingered in people's minds. The story had been told and retold so many times that almost everyone knew it by heart. Yet each person seemed to remember one part more than the rest. Some remembered the moment the gun was raised. Others remembered the way Keanu stayed still. And many remembered the quiet dignity he carried through it all. Keanu himself didn't spend his days thinking about it. He returned to his quiet routines, visiting a few friends, walking in the park, and spending time on small personal projects. But there were reminders everywhere. Strangers would come up to him with soft smiles, saying things like, "You handled yourself with so much grace," or "You kept your cool when most couldn't." He would thank them politely, but never linger on the subject. The widow of the funeral reached out again, this time inviting him to visit her home for tea. She wanted to talk about her late husband, to share stories rather than grief. Keanu accepted, and one afternoon, he found himself sitting in her small living room, surrounded by photos and warm sunlight. She told him about how her husband had loved fishing, how he would always hum the same tune while fixing things around the house, and how he would have been touched that someone like Keanu came to say goodbye. They spoke for hours, and not once did the gun incident come up. It was a relief, a reminder that life could still be about normal, human connections rather than headlines. Before leaving, Keanu promised her he would visit again, and she told him her door would always be open. Meanwhile, in the larger world, the story became something people pointed to in conversations about respect and restraint. Some used it to argue for better police training, others to show that calmness could change the outcome of tense situations. A few even said it was proof that public attention could make a difference when justice needed to be done. A month later, Keanu was approached by a community group that wanted to honor him with an award for composure under pressure. He politely declined, telling them that he didn't want recognition for something he believed anyone should do. "It's not about me," he explained. "It's about remembering we can choose not to add to the chaos." They understood. But his refusal only made them admire him more. One afternoon, while walking down a quiet street, Keanu passed a cafe with a small TV in the corner. The sound was low, but the image on the screen caught his eye. It was the body cam footage from that day, being used in a news segment about de-escalation training. The anchor was explaining how the clip had been included in a police academy program to teach officers the importance of measured action. Keanu paused for a moment, watching silently, then continued walking without a word. The former officer who had pointed the gun disappeared from the public eye. No one saw him on the news anymore, but whispers circulated that he had moved to another town, his career in law enforcement over. People debated whether that was enough punishment. But for Keanu, it was no longer his concern. He had done what he could, and the rest was out of his hands. From time to time, people would still send him messages about how that moment had inspired them, not because of who he was, but because of how he acted. One message stood out in particular. From a young man who had been at the funeral: "You showed me that not every wrong needs to be met with rage. Sometimes the calmest voice is the strongest." Keanu read it twice before setting it down, feeling a quiet sense of peace. Seasons began to change, the heat of summer fading into the cooler winds of autumn. The cemetery where it had all happened grew quieter. The flowers at the grave changed with the months. Yet the ground there still held the memory of that strange day when grief and fear had collided. Keanu visited again, alone this time, carrying a small bouquet of white lily. He placed them gently on the grave, standing in silence for a while. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the soft rustle of leaves. He thought about his friend, about the widow, about the people who had been there. And then, finally, he thought about how life had gone on. As he turned to leave, a man walking by recognized him but didn't say a word. He simply gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement. Keanu returned the gesture, and they went their separate ways. No cameras, no noise, just a quiet human moment. And so the story ended not with more drama, but with a kind of stillness. The same stillness Keanu had shown that day. It became part of his life's quiet history, not something he sought, not something he celebrated, but something that stood as a reminder to others that even in the middle of chaos, dignity can be the choice you make, and sometimes that choice can change everything.